Here's an overview of how you can set up the AI chat element practically and integrate it with your backend. So in WeWeb here, I have the AI chat element on the page, and on the left here, I have this sidebar that has selectors. And with these selectors, I can switch between different chats, and I'll show you how I've set this up. So for this example, I'll be using Xano for my backend, but the premise of how you set this up in a backend applies regardless of which backend you're using. You'll need tables to store the conversations and messages, and you'll need some way of retrieving that information. In my case, in Xano, I have this threads table, this messages table, and this user table. The premise is that each thread, aka each conversation, will link to a user, and then every message will link to a thread. So basically, we have a user, they have multiple conversations with the assistant, and inside of each conversation, there's multiple messages. And for this basic example, I have 3 endpoints. One, to get the messages of a thread, so basically to get all of the messages of a single conversation. One, to get all the threads of a user, so to get all the conversations a user has had with the assistant. And then finally, one, to create a message inside of a thread, aka a conversation. So here I have this endpoint to get all threads of a user. Here I'm just querying the threads table and taking all threads where the user ID equals the auth ID, which basically just means get all threads that belong to the current user. Then in WeWeb, I have a collection set up for this. So we have the threads collection, and this calls the get threads of user endpoint and returns that data. And that collection is what populates this sidebar. So this thread list container is bound to that collection. So here we see all of the threads. And inside of the threads table, you can see I just have these 2 threads for the moment. They're linked to me as a user, chat1 and chat2. And inside of WeWeb, you can see we see the corresponding data. The next endpoint I have is get messages of a thread. So this takes a thread ID, gets the thread, checks to make sure that it belongs to the current user so that this is secure, and then gets all of the messages of whichever thread has been input. And then once again, I have a collection set up for this in WeWeb that gets all messages of a thread. And how I utilize this is inside of the logic tab, I have a fetch messages project workflow, where first I fetch that collection and I then save it into a variable inside of WeWeb. So I'm basically getting that data from my backend and then writing it into a variable on the front end. You'll see why I'm doing this in more depth shortly, but at a base level, I'm doing this just so we can very quickly show feedback to the user. So if they input something into the chat, we can update this variable so they see the updates in the UI pretty much instantly, as opposed to having to make a change to the backend and then wait to fetch that new data. So what this looks like in practice is that at a page level, I have this page level workflow where on page load, I'm fetching the threads collection so we can show all of the threads of the user here. And then when you click on one of these threads, I have a workflow set up that first saves the selected thread ID. So here I'm just saving the ID of whichever thread was clicked. And then straight after this, I run that fetch messages project level workflow. And as we saw, it fetches the messages of thread collection and then saves them to our front end variable. And just so you see how this works in depth, we have the messages of thread collection. And because just before this, we are saving the selected thread ID, inside of the collection itself, in the configuration, for the input thread ID, I'm passing in that variable. So the user clicks a thread, we save the ID to this variable, we then fetch this collection, and it utilizes the value of that variable, and we then save the result to our variable. And then finally, for this initial setup, for my messages of the chat, I have it bound to use that front end variable. So now when I click one of these threads on the left, we can see it loads in that data of the respective thread, aka the conversation. And then just for UX purposes, I have this skeleton loader and its display is bound to whether or not that collection is fetching. And so now we want to handle the sending of messages and getting that response from the assistant. So in order to do this, you're going to need a few variables in your front end. In this AI chat folder, I have all the variables related to the AI chat. And the 2 that you'll need that we haven't discussed is this AI chat streamed response, which is an array, and a Boolean variable called isStreaming. And this will control whether or not we're currently streaming the response from that assistant. And so when you have these 2 variables created, you'll want to bind them to the settings of the AI chat. So I already have them set up here, but I'll unbind them just so you can see exactly where you need to bind them. So with isStreaming on here, you'll have access to this streaming text property. And this is what controls exactly what text gets shown here whenever isStreaming is on. So for example, if I type in here, you can see in real time, whatever I'm typing in is getting shown as a message. But if I turn off isStreaming, you can see it's not shown. So this is just basically a utility prop that lets you handle the streaming of responses while we're getting it back from the assistant. So to use this practically, you'll want to bind the streaming text property, and you'll want to bind it to your AI chat streamed response array variable. You'll see how we utilize this shortly. And then for the isStreaming property itself, you'll also want to bind this and bind it to your isStreaming Boolean variable. And so now how all of this comes together is that in the workflows of the AI chat, you'll want to create a workflow and you'll want to use the trigger on message sent. And I'll explain what all of these actions do now. So the first thing we'll want to do is we're going to want to reset our AI chat streamed response variable. The reason for this is just because, as you saw, when I typed something in to the AI chat streamed response variable, it was being shown in real time. And whenever we have a new message sent, we want to show brand new content in that AI chat streamed response here. And so the first thing we want to do whenever a message gets sent is reset that so we can populate it with brand new content and not have it accidentally show the content from the previous run of this workflow. The next thing we want to do is add the user's message. So here I am basically creating an object where I pass in the ID, the role, the content, and the created at. The reason I'm doing this is that this is what is the structure of my AI chat messages variable. So if I open this up in the data panel, you can see the values here, and you can see I have an ID field, a created at field, a content field, and a role. And these fields are crucial to making the AI chat element work correctly because the ID needs to be unique so it can properly display the message. And very importantly, the created at will dictate exactly what timestamp you see here. The content controls exactly what text content populates the message, and the role dictates whether or not the message is shown as a user message or as an assistant message. So in this workflow, when I'm adding the user message, I'm matching that format. So I'm using an ID, a role, content, and the created at. And what I use to populate these fields is that inside of this lightning bolt tab, we have values passed by the event. And so I can bind this to the ID, which is just randomly generated. The role I've hard coded because this will be the user message. The content, I can use the content field that gets passed by the event because this will be whatever the user has just typed in. And then the created at, I'm passing the timestamp that gets passed by the event because this will be in real time, whatever the timestamp is of the current moment. And just to show you what this looks like step by step, I'm going to disable this from continuing just so I can test this in isolation. And so now whenever I send a message, it will get added to just the user messages variable so I can show you what this looks like. So if I now say this is a test message and send it, you can see it gets populated in the AI chat element. And this is because now in the AI chat messages variable that we're using, you can see we have a new item and it looks like this with a random ID, the role of user, the content of what I typed, and the created at is the current timestamp. So that's the reason for this action. The next core part of this workflow is these three actions. So show streaming, create chat completion, and then hide streaming. These two actions, so show streaming and hide streaming, these change the value of that isStreaming Boolean variable, which control whether or not we want to show whatever is populated into the streaming text property inside of the chat. And the reason we're doing this now is that in this create chat completion action that comes from the OpenAI plugin, we have the ability at the bottom to stream the response. And when we set this to true, we can choose which variable we stream this response to. And as you can see, we're streaming it to the AI chat streamed response variable, which is what we have bound to that streamed text property on the AI chat element. And then for the messages, here I'm just passing our AI chat messages variable, and I'm using a map formula. Now, the reason I'm doing this is that the OpenAI API, which is what this action uses behind the scenes, expects this format. So it expects a role field and a content field, as you can see, like so. So user messages and assistant messages. And this map formula allows us to take all of the items in our AI chat messages, as we can see in this list, and we can see there's various fields in our AI chat messages. However, so it doesn't cause any issues with OpenAI, I'm only including the content field and the role field because this is what it expects behind the scenes. And so basically how this all comes together is we set isStreaming to true, we call the OpenAI action, it streams the response to that variable that we have bound to the stream text property on the AI chat element. As that text is coming in, we see it in real time in the AI chat. And then once we have the full response back from OpenAI, we turn isStreaming to off, so we no longer see that streamed response text. And so if I again now put a pass-through condition of false here, just to show you what this looks like up to this point, what we'll see is that whatever I type in gets added as a message so we can see it. We will then call OpenAI and you'll see the response streamed in real time. However, once we have that full response back, we'll set this to off, which will mean the text will disappear. And so if I now give it a prompt, just so we can see that streamed response, you can see the response was streaming, and then as soon as we had the full response back, we could no longer see the text. And the reason for this is because once we have the response back, we turned is streaming to off, which hid the streamed text. And so of course, for UX purposes, we don't want to just hide the entire message. We now want to continue displaying it, which is what these final two actions do. So this first action, random ID, here I'm just using some JavaScript to generate a random unique ID. The reason I'm doing this is that every item in our chat messages variable has an ID field, so I just need a random unique ID that I can use for this. And then finally, I'm adding an assistant message so we can save that message instead of just hiding it. And the structure of this message is identical to the user message we created before. The only difference is the values that we use. So for the ID, I'm using this random ID that I generate, whatever the result is of that. For the role, I'm setting it to assistant. For the content, I'm using whatever the result was of this chat completion action. So in the lightning bolt tab, I can see the result of all of the actions in this workflow. And in action 4 here, this is the chat completion action. And in this choices list, in the message, this is the content we get back from OpenAI. And that's what I have bound here. So we save whatever we get back. And then finally, for the created at, I'm using this date real-time formula. And this comes with the date plugin that we have. And so this will just basically save a timestamp of whatever the current time is. And the reason we have this error here is just because this is never ran. So if I run this to generate a random ID, this now has a result, and so this will properly populate. And so if I run this in its entirety now, so I'll refresh the page to reset all of the data. And if I now ask it a question, you can see we got that response. It was first streamed in, and then the message was permanently populated. So we added the user message, we set show streaming response to true, we then streamed the response here, and then once the message had been received in its entirety, we set is streaming off, and because we then immediately save the response to our chat messages variable, which is what populates our chat element, we have the message permanently in the interface. Now the final core piece of this is saving this to our backend, because the issue is now that if I click off of chat 1 and then click back onto it, you can see we've lost all of our messages. And so the final core piece to preserve this data is that at the end of this workflow, I'm going to want to save the user's message and the assistant message to our backend. And for this, I finally have this messages endpoint, and this just takes the contents of the text, the thread ID, the role and attachments, if there is any, and saves it to the messages table. And so what I need to do at the end of this workflow is just add 2 requests to Xano, one to save the user message and another to save the assistant message. So the content of the user message will come from the event. So this content, the thread ID we have selected in a variable. So it will be the selected thread ID here. The role will be user, and for this we're not handling any attachments, so I'll leave the attachments blank, and then I can just copy this. The role will be assistant, and for the content I will just take what I already have, so this response from the OpenAI action, I will copy this, and then for the content here, paste it in. And so if I now try this again, if I now check my tables in Xano, I can see those 2 messages have been saved. So one from the user for what is WeWeb, and then another one for the assistant with the answer. So now in WeWeb, when we click off of this chat 1 and then click back onto it, we can see that data and those messages have been preserved. And the final thing you might want to add to this is some kind of on-error workflow to handle any cases where the saving of the data to the backend might not have worked, because the last thing you want is for a user to create a chat, so post a bunch of messages, But then all of the preservation in the backend has failed and the user isn't aware of this. So in this case, it's very useful to have something in the onError branch where on error, you show the user some kind of alert to notify them that none of their changes are correctly being saved. Now, one thing we haven't covered up to this point is the handling of attachments that are uploaded by the user. Now, the handling of attachments can be quite complex, and the reason this can be so complex is that every LLM, so every AI, expects those files sent to it in a different structure. So for example, right now in this create chat completion action with OpenAI, we send our AI chat messages variable, and this has a list of items like so. So a role, which is either user assistant and it's just text, and then content, which is whatever the user has typed in or the assistant has returned. And again, this is just text. And so the structure of each item looks like this with role and content. However, we need to adjust how we send this content to cater for uploaded files. And the way we do this is by changing the structure of our messages to look like this. So we still have our role field with our user or assistant, but the complexity comes in now how we need to structure the content field. You can see instead of just having text for the content, we now have this list of items. And in this list of items, we have the text content. So here we can see there's an item with the type text, and then the text is whatever the text content is. But then here for the images, we have separate items. So we have another item with the type image URL, and then image URL field, which has a nested item with the field URL, and then the URL of that image. And then likewise, in this example, there's another image being sent, and it has its own item, type image URL, an image URL field, and then another nested item with that URL. So basically, if we want to handle attachments, we need to construct this content list with an item for the text content the user has input, and then an item for every single file that has been uploaded, in this case an image. So we need to set the correct type for the item and then pass in the URL of that uploaded file. And so we need to make a few changes to accommodate for this new structure of the content we pass. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to create a new variable in our project. It's going to be an array variable, and the purpose of this new variable will be for us to store the uploaded attachments so we can then send them to OpenAI. So I'm going to just duplicate this variable because it's already an array and it's in this folder. And I'm just going to rename it AI chat attachments to send. And it'll just be a blank array for now. So now in our workflow where we send the message, we need to introduce logic to handle the attachments uploaded, send them to OpenAI, and then save them to our backend. So the first thing I'm going to do is in this reset variable value action, I'm also going to want to reset our variable which holds the attachments to send. And the reason for this is because every new run of this workflow will have new attachments. And so I don't want to send attachments from the previous message. So I want to reset this at the start of every run. And so in this action that calls OpenAI, we pass in the AI chat messages variable. And here is the action where we add the new message to that AI chat messages variable. And so here I'm going to want to pass in the newly uploaded attachments. Now we can't just use the attachments that get passed here. And the reason for this is that there needs to be some kind of special formatting, particularly of the URL. So it's in a format that we can, one, send to OpenAI, and then two, actually send to our backend. And since what we add in this action is what ends up getting passed to OpenAI, that pre-processing I do, so the URL is actually readable by OpenAI, I need to do before this action, so I can include those readable URLs in this action. And so I'll set up that processing of the attachments logic here. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is check if there was actually any attachments in the user's message. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to take the list of attachments that were passed in. I'm going to type .length, and this will basically give me how many items were in the list of attachments. And if this is greater than 0, then I know there was an attachment passed. And so if there was attachments passed, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to loop through every single attachment that was passed, because the attachments that get sent is a list of attachments. So we need to perform the action on every single attachment that is included in this list. And as mentioned, the reason we're doing this processing is so we can actually change the URL of the uploaded attachment to be something that OpenAI can understand and that we can then send to our backend. So the action I'm going to want to add into this loop is called encode file. I want the output format to be a data URL because this is a URL that OpenAI and our backend can utilize. Now for the file object I want to pass in here, it will be whatever attachment we're currently looping over. So to have some data to show here, I'm just going to take this action out and test this. And the reason I'm just doing this is because now if I go to bind it, if I try and find the loop attachments action, here in the item, we have some fake data to use, so we can just see how this would actually look when we bind it. And so what we want to bind here is the entire item itself, because this is a file object and this action expects a file object. This is just dummy data for now. However, when we run this in its entirety, this will be the live data. So it will be whatever attachment has just been uploaded by the user. And then the final thing I want to do is that whenever we have this encoded URL, I want to add this to our newly created variable. So our AI chat attachments descend. And so I will just add this to the very end of the list. Now, how we structure this item that we add depends on exactly how we've set up the bindings for the attachments of the AI chat element. So for example, for my AI chat element, for the ID, I have it set to just use an ID field. For the name, it's just a name field. For the URL, again, it's just a URL field. For the MIME type, it's .mime. And then finally, for the size, it's a size field. And so essentially, the item I now add to the new attachments variable, I want it to mirror this exact format. So I want it to have a size field with this exact case match of size, a MIME field, a URL field, a name, and an ID. And since I need an ID for this, I'm again going to use our random ID action, so I can populate this with a random ID. And so I'll now create this item. So I'm going to bind it, and I'm first going to add all of the fields that I need. So first an ID field, then a name field, then a URL field, a MIME field, and then finally a size field. And I'll close this off. And I'll now just add all of the values that I need. So for the ID, it will be whatever the result is of this random ID generation. I'm just going to change the name so I can find this a bit easier in the menu. Right now the result is undefined, but once we run this in its entirety and there is actually something to return, this will be populated. For the name field, I'm actually going to use the name of the current attachment being looped. So in the loop, inside of the current item, I'm just going to bind the name. For the URL, this will be the result of this encoding action, which I will also give a name to make it findable. And so then for the URL, I will just bind the result of this action. And again, this is undefined for now, just because we haven't tested this or ran it yet, but it will have a value when we run it in full. So I'll bind this to be the result. And then for the MIME field, I'm going to bind the type of the current item in this loop of the attachments. And then finally, for the size field, I'm going to do similar. So I'm going to go into the item being looped, and I'm going to bind the size. And this isn't returning correctly, but as said, this is expected because these haven't returned anything yet. But when we do run this in full, this will return correctly, and this item will be added to the end of this AI chat attachments descend variable. So then, once we have our attachments, whenever we create this user message that we then add to our AI chat messages variable, for the attachments here, all I need to do is replace this with our new attachments variable. Like so. And then before we can send this to OpenAI, we need to restructure the content of our messages. So as you saw here, OpenAI, when we're sending attachments, expects each message to have a content field with a list of all of the content, like so with the text content and each image URL. And so before we can send our chat messages to OpenAI, we need to restructure it to look like this, so OpenAI can accept it. And to be honest, the easiest way to do this is to actually use JavaScript and return a value utilizing JavaScript. So straight after we add that new user message item to our AI chat messages variable, I'm going to add a new action. I'm going to choose the return a value action. Here we'll be returning an array because basically we'll be recreating our AI chat messages variable, but restructuring it to be what OpenAI expects. I will give it a name, and then I will bind its value, and then change it from formula to be JavaScript. And here I have some ready-made code that I'll paste in. And essentially what this will do is it takes our AI chat messages variable and converts it to be the expected format for OpenAI when using attachments. So if I look at the value that this is returning, here you can see now for each message, instead of just having text with the content, we have an array. And if I expand this, you can see because we don't have any attachments, it's only text. But you can see there's an item for the text. So it's type text and then text content. So this is now structured correctly for OpenAI. This JavaScript is in our documentation, so you can copy and paste it into your project. When you do so, the only thing you need to change is you need to change this variable to be your messages variable. So you need to delete this, find your chat messages variable, and simply click on it to insert it here. So now that we have this, I can test it so we have a result in the workflow to utilize. And then lastly, in the chat completion action for the messages, instead of sending the AI chat messages variable, what I want to now send is the result of this OpenAI ready format action that we just performed here with the custom JavaScript. So I can delete this and replace it with the result of that action. And to make sure this is working, I'm just going to add a pass-through condition of false to test everything up to the point where we try and save it in the backend. So I can make sure that this is correctly taking images and using them as context. And so on the AI chat element, I will now turn on allow attachments, and I will ask a question and attach an image. And so now when I send this message, what will happen is that first of all, we will wipe the AI chat attachments so we don't use attachments from a previous run of this. If attachments have been uploaded, then we loop through each attachment. So in our case, an attachment has been uploaded. It will loop through all the attachments. In our case, there only is one. It will encode the URL so that we can use the URL. It will then add this new attachment to the end of this attachments variable. And then now when we add the user message, we're utilizing that list of attachments. And so since we're now utilizing this, whenever we send this message, we'll actually see the image in the chat. And then since we have this action, which formats our messages in a way which OpenAI expects, and we then pass this into OpenAI here, OpenAI will actually take the image as context and answer any questions we may have about it. And just before I send this image, to make things a bit more readable, right now I have inverted sorting on the chat, so I'm just going to remove this so we can actually see what we're doing properly. And so if I now send this, we can see that we have that image attached in the chat so we can actually visualize it. And you can see the response I got back from OpenAI was actually contextual to the image that I uploaded. So this seems to be working correctly, but just to make sure, I'll try attaching two images to make sure the looping of the attachments is working correctly. And we can see both images were visualized and the AI answered our question and took into context both of the images. So our workflow up to this point is working correctly. And so the final piece of this is we need to set up the saving of these attachments to our backend so that we can preserve these messages and their attachments. Now, how you do this is backend dependent, but for this use case, I'll walk through how you would do this with Xano. So in Xano, I have my endpoint to create a new message. And what I need to do is I need to set this up to accommodate for data URLs, because as we did prior, at this point, we're creating a data URL from the uploaded attachments. And so once this endpoint takes in those data URLs, it needs to turn them into an attachment that we can then save inside of Xano and save them in each record of messages. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new input. It's going to be an object. It will be a list of items because there might be multiple attachments that we want to send instead of just a single attachment. I will call it attached files. And for the schema of the object, we need two fields. So the first field we want will be in storage. We want it to be file resource because this basically means that it can be a date URL. And I will call it URL. And then for the second field, it will be a text field. And this will just be the name. So this will be the name of the file. So I'll add this and then confirm adding that new input. And we already have this attachments field that comes from the database link, but I'm going to hide this because we can't really utilize this. And the reason we can't utilize this is because we aren't sending fully fledged attachments. We need the ability to send a data URL, and this field expects an already created attachment. So we can't utilize this. So I'm going to hide it and then update it. So what I now need to do is I need to do similar to what we created in WeWeb. I need to set up a loop that goes through all of the input attachments. However, inside of this loop, we need to process the files so they're ready for Xano. So what I would do is beneath this precondition, I'm going to add a for each loop. The list of items I want to loop over will be the attached files, and each file we want to loop over will just be called a single file. And so then inside of this loop, the first action I want to perform is in file storage. I'm going to want to use the create attachment metadata action. And what this will allow us to do is that in this input, we will be passing those data URLs. And so this basically lets us take a data URL and turn it into a fully fledged attachment that we can save in our database. So as you remember, the schema of these items for the attached files was a URL field, which will be the data URL, and then a name field, which is just text, and this will be the name of the file. So in this create attachment action, for the value, I'm going to pass in the single file. So this is just whatever the current loop is of the attached files. And I want it to be this item's URL, so this item's data URL that we'll pass in. And then for the file name, it will just be the single file dot name. And again, the reason we're using URL and name here is because in the inputs, there's a URL and a name field. And since this loop is looping over these items, every item in the loop will have a URL and name field. And so when we try and use this inside of actions of the loop, we can simply just take the item of the loop and then utilize those URL and name fields of each item. I will return this as file. And then we need some way of keeping track of all of the attachments that we've created. So when we add this messages record at the very end, we can save all of those attachments. So what I will do is actually just before this for each loop, I'm going to create a variable. It's going to be called attachments to use, and it's just going to be an empty array. And so what I'm doing here is I'm creating this empty array. And so what we'll now do is inside of this loop, when we create the attachment, we'll save the attachment that's been created to this array. And so at the very end of it, once this loop has ran, all of the attachments we need will be inside of this array, which we can then use in this attachments field when we create the message. So the final action I want to add for this loop is I'm going to want to add to the end of an array. The existing array will be this attachments to use variable that we just created. And the item we want to add, so the value to add, will be the file that was just generated, like so. So I can save this. And then finally, in the add record messages action, I want to save the attachments, and all the attachments are being saved in this attachments to use variable. So I would just bind it here. And I can now publish this. And so now back in WeWeb, I can remove this pass-through condition, and I can go on to save user's message. This attachments field, we've now hit it, so I can delete it. And I will now pass my attachments into the attached files input we created. So again, just as a reminder, the structure of this attached files expected each item to have a URL and a name. And so when I pass my list of attachments into this input, I'm going to only want to pass the URL and the name. So I'll bind this. I will pass in my list of attachments. And we can see we're passing it in here. However, as mentioned, we only want to pass the name field and the URL field. And to do this, we can utilize the map array filter. So we can define exactly which fields of the item get passed in. So I can place the map filter here. I can change the position of this variable to now be in the map filter. And here I can define each field that I want to be used. So first will be the URL and then the name. So now we can see we're passing in a list of items, each with a URL and each with a name. And for the assistant message, we don't need to touch it because it won't have any attachments. So now if I come off of chat one and I go back onto chat one just so it resets the data, when I now send those exact same messages, they should save correctly to our backend with the attached files so we can consistently preserve that data. So if I ask it the same questions with the exact same images, we can see once again, the image is visualized in the chat. We have a correct contextual answer back from OpenAI. And now in the messages table, I can see those two messages have been saved. And now in the attachments column, we also actually have that attachment. And so what this means is if I was to click off of chat one and go back onto it, we now actually have preserved that data. And so the attachments, in this case, the image, will consistently be displayed. And one final test to make sure the looping of the attachments is working in Xano. We can see the answer back is correct. And in Xano, if I refresh the data, we can see we have those two messages. The message with the attachments does indeed have two attachments. And if I click off of chat one and go back onto it, we can see those two images have been preserved. So that's how you can set up the chat element to utilize attachments. Now, just a note for this, how you have to structure things is very, very dependent on exactly what AI model you're sending these things to. So in our case, since we were sending to OpenAI, OpenAI expects a text item and these image URL items. However, depending on which AI you're using, the structure it expects to utilize attachments may be completely different. The easiest way to cater for whatever structure your AI expects is to do similar to what I did here. So before you send this to the AI, you have some kind of action to restructure your chat messages. And probably the easiest way to do this will be to use JavaScript. But don't be too intimidated by this, because you can just use AI to actually generate the JavaScript. So in this case, you could just create a new action for returning a value. It will most likely be an array that you need. You can bind it, open the AI panel, and in here, you can simply just pass in your chat messages variable. Paste in an example of what the AI expects, so the structure of the content that it expects, and then ask AI to restructure your AI chat messages into whatever structure your AI expects when you're using attachments. If you do end up using OpenAI and copying the workflow that I have here, just know that in this example, we only structured things to handle images as attachments. So for example, in the content, whenever I expand these, you can see the type is image URL for both. And this code I have here only caters to detect images and define them as type image URL. And so if you do end up using this approach, just know you will need to adjust this to cater for things other than just images so it can define the correct type for OpenAI.